Yeah, good morning. Welcome back to our final lecture in economics of regulation. As always, if you have not yet joined me in Webex, please do. Just two other announcements. First of all, as I already told you, this is a final lecture. Next week you will have tutorial classes twice, and in a final week there will be another assignment, and we have this review session. This is just due to this switch to all the holidays we had. And the other important, and that's what I want to show you, the important announcement is that we would like to have your feedback both on the tutorial class, as you see here, and on the lecture. So please evaluate these courses and give us your opinion and suggestions, what we could improve and so on, what you liked and what you didn't. Okay, that's great. If you could do that, and after these preliminaries, I just want to start with the stream. And as always, if there are any questions, just ask them in Webex. And of course, there will be breaks. And if there are any problems, please just tell me. Okay, we start with the stream. Welcome back to our final lecture of the Economics of Regulation course. Today, we finally get to the point where we discuss how to introduce competition in network industries. We will discuss this in some detail, what kind of problems we face once we want to introduce competition, how we might do that, whether and how access regulation works. But before we do that, we compare what we get in terms of an outcome if we have a regulated monopoly versus some unregulated situation where some competition might arise. Actually, we pick up here a discussion we already had in chapter 5, and I want to start with this. So we do a comparison between what to expect if we regulate a monopoly compared to the situation where we allow competition and where we might end up with an unregulated duopoly, for instance. I want to start here with what I think is a quite strange quote by Armstrong and Seppington. It's from their survey article in the German Journal of Economic Literature. And they state that in an economic paradise where a regulator is omniscient, benevolent, and able to fulfill any promises he makes, competition cannot improve upon regulated monopoly. Why is this strange? It's a very strange picture of an economic paradise. Actually, if you have the metaphor of Adam Smith's invisible hand, in mind, it's quite different. So we don't need a regulator to be in paradise. Just our own aim to maximize our own utility yields a result that somehow maximizes the total surplus. So that is social welfare. Okay. So this is really a strange picture. And of course, the background is that they want to contrast this picture, this ideal in a sense. And if we have an ideal regulator who knows everything and keeps all the promises he makes or she makes, then we actually would not need any decentralized mechanism. Okay, but the point is, and that's somehow what might justify something like such a quote, is that we move on, Armstrong and Seppington, that in practice regulator has too little information about market conditions. The regulator is susceptible to capture and comes under pressure to change policy. That's a commitment issue. So all these issues we discuss in these chapters on adverse selection and moral hazard, where the regulator faced this asymmetric information problem. So we know, first of all, that regulated monopoly is not a perfect one and does not maximize social surplus in a sense, but is some second best rule. At the same time, competition is not always textbook perfect either, and that's in particular the point. So they rather do not have this Adam Smith invisible hand in mind, because the point is that if we have really economies of scale, we might only have a few firms being active in the market if there are more than one at all, and of course then we get prices above marginal cost. And we might also get, if we have only a few firms in the market, the danger that these firms collude. And finally, in order for competition to work, you need consumers who hunt for bargains and who look for the lowest price. Okay, in Germany that works rather well in a way, but even we have some markets and some industries where it does not work so well. So consumers are not as diligent, that's how Armstrong Seppington put it, as desirable to secure vigorous competition. In the notes, I give you an example from the UK, from the United Kingdom, about behavior of consumers in electricity and energy markets more general, like the gas market as well. It is shown that they don't switch suppliers even though they could save a lot of money. And similar things hold for Germany. after having gone through several bankruptcies like Telfax, so you might even think that it was not so bad after all if you don't switch, but that's another topic, okay? The point is very often there is a lot of inertia among consumers, and that means that competition works less than perfect. So the important point is here, we have to compare imperfect regulation with imperfect competition, okay? What we do next is just put this in a more, okay, that's actually what I just said here. The choice between monopoly regulation and unregulated oligopoly is a choice between two imperfect mechanisms. It's always almost the same statement I had in Chapter 5, okay? It's clear that the regulated monopoly has some advantages because it preserves the economies of scale. It is also possible to have some kind of cross-subsidization. So we can impose any tariffs we like in the market and so redistribute via prices. So for instance, we can have the same price in rural areas as in urban areas, even though costs are much higher in rural areas, okay? Or at the same time, we can extract the profits from these markets like the German government did from the Deutsche Bundespost, from the telecoms part of that, in order to finance some other things and like what in former times the municipal utilities did in terms of having high electricity prices in order to fund from these profits than like public transport or the public swimming pools, okay? And at the same time, and that's what we saw really in our theoretical models, that if we can use transfer payments, we typically can have improve incentives, can pay a rent, an information rent, so in order to induce truthful revelation and so on, okay? And at the same time, there are advantages of unregulated oligopoly, of an unregulated situation. If we don't have a regulation, we don't need a regulator, and the regulator is costly, okay? Here are some data for the UK, for the Ofcom. There's a telecoms regulator there. In Germany, it's not so clear what the cost of the BNetzA is, the Federal Network Agency, because the Federal Network Agency has many different tasks apart from simply regulating industries, like some technical, in Germany we would say TÜV, some technical overview of technical devices and so on, which has nothing got to do with regulation in our sense here. It might be clear in Austria where you have dedicated regulators for telecoms like the RTR or the dedicated regulator for the energy sector, which would be the e-control. You just might look up what their budgets is. Of course, just a small comment here, just I think 2 days ago I got received a newsletter from RTR, the Austrian telecom regulator, where they stated, or they had a balance sheet and their loss and profit statement, and where you can in detail look up, I think that they have 8 million or something like that in terms of revenue, and that's what they spend, okay? And then you can think, okay, 8 million, actually that was really the number, that's €1 per Austrian per Austrian living in Austria, okay? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is that expensive or not? Okay, so that's these direct costs of regulation. Of course, this is almost dwarfed by the indirect cost of regulation in terms of lobbying expenses. All these regulated companies have huge regulatory management departments. And that's a good thing, of course, for you economists, because that means we get many well-paid shops. But on all, of course, it's just a cost to the economy, okay? And two important points we just recently discussed within the topic of introducing competition, even though we have local monopolies. That was the sampling benefit and the rent reducing benefit. So monopoly regulation typically involves a single firm. And of course, if there are several, you have the higher chance that you get a low-cost one. This would be the sampling benefit. And at the same time, of course, if you have several rivals where the costs are somehow correlated, you know from the cost of the one firm almost or very good the cost of the other firm. And this reduces the information advantage, and you get what we call there the so-called rent reducing benefit. Of course, the danger of capture is lower because now you don't know which of the 2 or 3 or 4 firms in a market as a regulator you should in a sense benefit, because it might be that the other firm is the one who really makes or is the most important in a market and so on. At least it's in a sense you have countervailing powers. And finally, competition typically should increase the incentive to supply quality. Okay, so we compare two different that's what we put on the last slide, two different imperfect mechanisms, okay? And how should we do that? Of course, we did that in a very general way here and also in the fifth chapter with some general arguments. Here we just want to use our framework, our Baron-Meyerson framework we developed in this part on adverse selection, because then we can directly show in terms of our model under what circumstances this regulated monopoly is better than competition and vice versa. Okay, and we know that this regulation will be imperfect as we have asymmetric information. Again, suppose we have some social cost of public funds here. I denoted with a capital lambda in your notes. It will be a small lambda. I just changed it in order to be coherent with chapter 18. Okay, then suppose the two states are equally likely, so just we assume that phi is equal to 1/2 for simplicity. And these are just the standard kind of terms we developed up there. So the welfare with cost CI, welfare in state I, is just consumer surplus minus the transfer I pay. And of course, the transfer is costly if you have the social cost, or is more costly when one-to-one if we have the social cost of public funds. And we take account of the rent the firm gets. And typically we assume that alpha is equal to 0, but here we just did it differently. And here we rearranged it in a way we also did in chapter 9 and 10. And here, what you might notice is here in the definition of total surplus, we take into account that funds are costly in the sense that it costs you more than €1 if you want to pay transfers. Okay, and in that sense, you would also see if you have, if you tax, for instance, your utility, your regulated company, that gives you, this tax income gives you a utility of more than €1. So €1 in terms of taxes you get from the profits here gives you more than €1, because that reduces the distortion of the taxation system by more than €1 due to the social cost of public funds. And of course, what is always clear, the revenue, the rent of the firm is simply its profit minus a fixed cost plus the transfer. Okay, and what we always know is that the full information prices maximize W here, of course, and taking into account here, that does not mean that these prices are equal to marginal cost. Remember, if we have a very high lambda, the price might even be equal to monopoly, okay, price. But this was the discussion in chapter 8, remember, 8.1. Okay, but that's nothing new, and in the next part we will abstract from lambda being positive and so on. And what we are doing here then is, what we arrived up there is that we simply have here this welfare maximization problem, where we have the WL, where we have here the rent of the firm, of the low type firm, and here of course the welfare from the high state. And if we have some costs, like remember this 150 million pounds for Ofcom, this would be the G, is the fixed cost of regulation, which is financed from public funds, and therefore we have a lambda here. Of course we have to take that into account once we compare that with another regulatory mechanism, which is no regulation, okay, which is our competitive situation. Okay, but apart from that, this is exactly like what we previously did. And what we know already is that if lambda is equal to 0, and if you also set the fixed costs and the government expenditure here on the regulation is 0, we get immediately from the Baron-Meyerson exactly this point. Here I could just move to show you. What you will miss here is somehow the plus alpha. The plus alpha, the rent, but the point is this just cancels out, as can immediately be shown. Oh, actually, I showed that. You know, you have the OneNote notes to the lecture available here, and I think, oh, I don't know whether I did it here at all. Yeah, actually, it's here. The point is with if I manage to put it up somehow, I don't manage here. Oh yeah, now it worked. Okay, the point here is, and hopefully this was slide 319 I was at, with this special assumption of phi equal to 1/2. We get the situation where, note that we always get a price which is higher, which would be this one here. The Baron-Meyerson price is higher than the marginal cost of the high type here. And we know we get this as a rent then, the green area as a rent for the high type, for the low type. And this is exactly cancelled out by the profit of the high type here, which of course then works as a tax. So in this special case, this just cancels out, and that's why we get this situation here. Okay, of course, this is not nice anyway, because here, even though we have the good state here with price equal to marginal cost, if we have the low type, with the high type, the price is rather distorted. Okay, that's our outcome. Okay, and in the notes I have put that in more detail. Now, unregulated monopoly. How do we model that? And I think this is really nice how Armstrong-Sappington model this. They just look into the situation of duopoly and assume that there are two firms which supply a homogeneous product and they know each other's cost. So of course, under competition, we don't pay any transfers, so lambda plays no role. Welfare is VP, just the total, the consumer surplus, plus, of course, again, if we have an alpha which is positive, a weight of the firm's profits, we have to account also of the profit pie. Now, what we assume here is that each firm has a probability of low cost equal to 1/2, and that's the standard assumption we made above as well, phi equal to 1/2. But now we assume that there might be some correlation between the cost of the two firms. Just remember our audit analysis, or the case where we had this information model of, or the reporting version of the yardstick model, where I told you something about Stadtwerke Gießen and Stadtwerke Marburg. Okay. Now the point is here: if rho were equal to 1, it would be perfectly correlated. If rho were equal to 1/2, it's completely independent and uncorrelated. And if we have 3/4, for instance, you know that if the one firm has high cost, the other firm is also quite likely that it has high cost. Now, what we know here with Bertrand prices. If we get price competition, we get almost always price equal to high price. Why? Now, because if both firms have high cost, of course, price will be equal to marginal cost, and this will be equal to CH. If one firm has low cost and the other firm has high cost, the low cost firm will charge a limit price, which we, for simplicity, assume just to be equal to the cost of the rival. Might also be looking into a case where it's CH minus an epsilon, but we just do not take this epsilon into account. And only if both firms have low costs, and that's with probability rho of 1/2, okay, we get P equal to CL, okay. Why is it with 1/2? Now, with probability rho, they have the same cost, okay? And so you can only have the same cost if rho applies. With probability 1 minus rho, they have different costs. We will see that in more detail. And of course, they have to have the same cost and the low cost state. So, and this is also probability 1/2. Okay, now, the firm's profit is 0 unless it has low cost and its rival has high cost. And then it has this profit here, the quantity from marginal cost, and actually this would be our standard rectangle here, CH minus CL. And the expected industry profit is then, we get only a profit if both firms have different costs, and that's the probability. With probability rho, they have the same cost, and with probability 1 minus rho, they have different costs, and when we get this profit. And what is interesting, and that's what we will have in an assignment, of course, is the expected profit of a single firm is just this expression here divided by 2, because it's only half. It has only 50% a chance that it's a low type firm. And ignoring fixed cost of production, and this is of course a very important assumption, because after all we are in network industries where sunk and fixed costs are very, very important. And if we ignore these fixed costs, our welfare is just the following. And here you see again our probabilities. With probability rho, both firms have the same cost, and with probability 1/2, it will be low cost. So rho over 2 gives us a price equal CL, and therefore we get the respective net consumer surplus. With the converse probability, of course, 1 minus this expression, we get the high price, and just here the respective net consumer surplus, and with probability 1 minus rho here, we get these rent here, and of course we evaluate it as alpha. This should be rather clear, and we will have an assignment on that, or actually a very nice one, and you will see it's rather straightforward to calculate that, and hopefully it becomes. Just to show you the assignment, so this is next week on I think on Thursday. Here we have these question with regulated monopoly versus unregulated duopoly, and here you see this part where you should calculate the level of fixed costs so that risk neutral firms would enter. So, and hopefully it should get clear after you have solved this problem. Okay. It's completely clear there. Now we want to compare these two regimes. Now what we did is just compare or derive the welfare we have in the two states, and now we can compare the two regimes and answer the question, under what circumstances is it better to have a regulated monopoly that is not allow for competition, or when we should allow for competition and liberalize the market, for instance. And for that purpose, we just assume, to make life easy, that all of these not so nice variables like lambda, like G, and in particular F, so this is a particularly sensible or sensitive assumption here, that all these are zero, okay? In particular, this F we will discuss in much more detail later. Now, what we wish to compare is, this was our Baron-Meyerson welfare, and this was our welfare under competition. And these are two ugly expressions, but what we immediately see, if they are almost perfectly correlated, we get here with probability 1/2, which would be the same. We get we get the low type with probability 1 minus 1/2. We get a lower price than here, okay? Because we don't have a distortion, and then this would be zero anyway, and so it's clearly better. And the point is here, it's not due to the sampling benefit, because it's perfectly correlated, so the chance that you have a low cost type is not higher, because it's simply 1/2, but we completely destroy rents, okay? The problem is, however, this works only if F is equal to 0, because, you know, if we have positive fixed cost, we won't have two Bertrand firms in the market, okay? Remember our discussion of the wall of attrition. Here we don't assume that we have contested markets, so anyway, so we wouldn't have a problem at all anyway. But anyway, if raw is high, the duopoly is better, okay, in a sense. And the other point is, then demand is inelastic. The duopoly is superior when demand is elastic. The monopoly, the regulated monopoly, is superior. And in the first case, the sampling benefit is important. In the second case, the efficient price of low cost type is important. Again, here, this is not actually, I should have this sentence here. You have to remind me of that. I just show you now how we come up with this here. This is again what we have. I put down here these two equations, and I just tried to do it in a general way. But what actually works here is what you see here. If demand is inelastic, what matters here? Actually, so hopefully you are able to see my rather sketchy diagrams here. If demand is rather inelastic, and that would be this blue, and now I put it green line here. The price, remember here, we assume phi is equal to 1/2, so the price is always the same pH. And what you see here, if demand is inelastic, you hardly have any. I'm not even able to draw a triangle here. You hardly have any advantage from inducing truthful revelation. Okay, you actually never get the situation in which you have a low-cost firm, because you have to pay so much in terms of rent that it does not work. Okay. So with inelastic demand, it's clear that duopoly is better, because you have at least some chance that you have a low price and low cost outcome. If demand is elastic, and I think where is demand elastic? I have a diagram here as well, didn't I? Yeah, here is it. Okay. With demand elastic, you see you have a really huge rectangle here. Consumer surplus gain from inducing truthful revelation, okay? And now with monopoly, your chance that you get the low outcome is much higher than with competition, because there you have the raw is smaller than 1, okay? So the point is, you have a higher likelihood that you have this low cost outcome, and therefore this very long in the extreme, if the curve would be flat, it's almost infinitely much, okay? So that's what you have. So hopefully it got something clear here. Efficient pricing of low cost type, you get a higher probability if rho is smaller than 1 that you get this low type. And this is particularly important if demand is elastic, as this triangle is very, very large what you gain here. Okay, hopefully this didn't didn't confuse you, but helped. Okay. Anyway. Okay, you see, I was not really convinced that it improved it, but I hope it's clear. So in the one case with the very inelastic demand, you don't get any triangle. So there is no sense to induce truthful revelation because you would have to pay these high rents. And in the case of inelastic demand, your triangle is really large, so that it's really important that you have this effect. You can look it up in your note tab, in your one note. Okay. Now comparing the regimes. Okay, what I already said. Clearly, substantial fixed costs make monopoly more likely because you don't have duplication of efforts. And what is even more important, if F is substantial, and I also told you that if these costs are rather likely to be perfectly correlated, it's rather unlikely that two firms will enter the market at all. Okay, unless you provide some financial assistance, some subsidies. And so the problem is you get many examples there. Duopoly would, in principle, give you a better result, but actually never two firms would enter. Okay, and that's what we will discuss also in more detail below. Of course, another advantage of regulation of a regulated monopoly is if you don't have a good income tax system, for instance, and therefore if lambda is large, like in developing country, we discussed that earlier, then another motive for monopoly is just that you have a very high social value if you can extract profits from these regulated industries. So if you don't have a tax office and only your regulated telecoms or energy company, you just get all your public funding from these companies. Okay. And finally, if regulation is very imperfect, the balance swings back to duopoly. So, and what is straightforward and hopefully clear, if transfers are not possible, welfare with the monopoly is always inferior to duopoly. Why is that? Now, if transfers are not possible, you never get truthful revelation. So you never get, here you see only CH, you never get CL. And of course, that's always worse. Even though you have, suppose for alpha equal to 0, you don't mind for the rent of the firm, and you never get the other state. And with competition, you have at least some probability that you get the other state. Okay, that was our comparison. Actually, we made many of the points already in chapter 5, and here we just put more structure into this discussion and showed on what it depends, okay? And you will see, in particular, if we have fixed costs, we run into trouble because even though competition might be beneficial in a sense or superior, we don't get firms entering the market. And that's what we are going to discuss in the next topic. Before I move on, I make a short break here and check whether everything works and whether there are any questions. Okay, also a short break here. Yeah. Okay, now we start with our problem, how to introduce competition in the market and which problems might we face if we allow for free entry. The point is that, of course, now we came up with our solution. Okay, regulated monopoly is better than competition is better than regulated monopoly. How do we want to achieve competition? What is almost a philosophical question here is, would we ever want to ban entry even in situations where, according to Armstrong and Sepping, regulated monopolies prefer to competition? So in many instances, would we just want to say, oh, we don't want to have far distance buses, we don't want to have coaches, because we want to protect some other part, okay? Somehow it has got to do with freedom to act and with liberalism, and it's going to be an interesting question, okay? Of course, here I do not refer to competition. We will look into below, like where we need an act by the regulator, like in access regulation, in order to have competition, like in telecoms for a long time. But in situations where, like for instance, in letters or in postal business or in far distance buses, where you just could hire some bus driver and transport people from A to B, okay? And you don't need the structure or the infrastructure of Deutsche Bahn, for instance. Of course, there are cases in which we do not want to have competition. Patents, for instance, or just a legal instrument to ban some competition. Okay, giving all this, and this has all something got to do with this initial quote I gave you about this economic paradise, I now want to look into which problems we run into once we allow for free entry. And here there are three main problems with the simple policy of allowing entry. First of all, there might be an inefficient pattern of entry when incumbent's tariff does not reflect its cost. And actually that's what was behind this decision to ban far distance buses, to ban coaches in Germany for such a long time. On the other hand, you might get excess entry. That is too much of a good thing. You might, even though you want to have competition, you might have too many entrants in the market. And what is probably the more important problem in most network industries is that you do not get entry even if you want to have entry. Then that's the question is, how do you assist then entry, and how do you get entry really to happen? Okay, and we now step for step we look into these problems here. First of all, which problems do arise when tariffs does not reflect costs? And this is now an important argument in a sense, because this is typically the argument behind something like banning entry from really people from entering, even though they wouldn't need any infrastructure like the far distance buses and so on, or like letter business here. Remember, for some until very recently, the Deutsche Post had a monopoly on letters. Then it was only on letters of a certain weight and so on. Okay, now to put some formal analysis into this, we have some incumbent, call him that incumbent Deutsche Bahn or Deutsche Post, and they have a deal costing C* per subscriber and offered at a regulated price. And the background of all this discussion is that this regulated price might not reflect cost. Okay, might not reflect cost because we have the same price to deliver a letter to a city than we have it to a North Sea island. Okay, and of course costs are very different. Okay, the potential entrant then can supply identical service but at possibly different costs C per subscriber. The entry, what is clear, is socially desirable if the costs of the entrant are lower than the cost of the incumbent. Unfortunately, the entrant is profitable if the costs of the entrant are lower than the price of the incumbent, and these costs only coincide if, in a sense, prices are truly reflect cost. Okay, price equal to the cost of the incumbent. And there are three problems here with free entry. If the price does not reflect costs, if price is above costs, there is a danger of what economists call cream skimming entry. In German, this would be Rosinenpicken, or in Bavarian, Rahmenabschöpfen, which is even a literal translation of this cream skimming here. Okay, we will go into detail below. The other problem is that we might have even a lack of efficient entry in regions where the price is below the incumbent's cost. This is a less visible kind of inefficiency, but it might happen where we say supply people in remote areas with say fixed line internet access, even though it would be better to supply them with mobile telephony. Okay, that's what we will see below. And of course, the basic problem, or the most important problem, is that if you have then this widespread cream skimming entry, you get typically funding difficulties for incumbents. So you get trouble if you had cross subsidization. And very often the response to these problems is to just ban entry. Remember, we had a monopoly in postal services until recently. So even though I think it's called Mittelhessen Mail, even though this company would easily be able to deliver all the invoices of Stadtwerke Gießen and of Sommerland and so on to people living in the Gießen area, they were not allowed to do so. Okay, and you will see later on how it worked actually. Yeah. Another response, of course, the standard thing would be just make your prices cost-based, and that's called rebalance the tariffs. But the problem is that this is not always politically feasible to say, okay, urban areas you get much lower prices, rural areas you get very high prices. Or in terms of German electricity, I have alluded to that many times. So because due to the lack of transmission capacity, we have a lot of electricity production in the north of Germany. We have the consumption focus in the south of Germany. Still, we have these bottlenecks. The point is that we actually should have higher electricity prices in the south of Germany, but that's not politically feasible. Okay. Okay, so what is the solution? And this is a rather abstract solution. We would need an output tax, and on the next slide, I just will give you an example of such a tax. That is, the income or the entrant should pay some output tax which is equal to, in a sense, the cost distortion of the price. So how much the price differs from the cost of the incumbent. Okay, so these probably look rather abstract, but I will give you an example right now of what is called the Universal Service Fund, which is just serves to in a sense, subsidize rural areas, for instance. And you will see all of that, all of this discussion can be put in this simple table here. And actually, we will have a few of these problems in our assignment, and it should be rather clear. Now, suppose you have an urban area in your country and a rural area, and there are more people living in the urban area than in the rural area. And the most important point here is that it costs more to supply people in the rural area than in the urban area. It's rather clear. Think of the internet connection or the telecom connection. Due to the density of population in the urban area, the prices are lower in urban areas. Same would hold for postal services. Okay, urban areas just easier because you don't have to walk another kilometer until you get to the next household. Okay, and what is also very typical in many countries is that even though the costs are different, prices are the same in urban and rural areas. And this is the distortion we have. Okay, so we don't have the cost-based prices, but typically for political reasons, we have higher prices, the same prices, and that means that we have a loss in rural areas and we make a profit in urban areas. Okay, and you see the example is put in a way so that you have 1 billion of profit in the urban area and 1 billion of loss in the rural area, so which this is simply just covered with the profit from the urban areas. Okay, now what would happen here if we allow just entry? Now, yeah, if we allow just entry, think above our cases we had. Entry, if we would not have some output tax here, okay, just these prices in urban area, the price is 100. Under what circumstance could a firm enter this urban area? Actually, if costs of the entrant are smaller than 100. So if it's 99, it could enter and make profits of, say, excuse me, €1 times 20 million. Okay. Of course, this would be highly inefficient, and at the same time, it would destroy the profit in the urban areas, which is used to subsidize the losses in the rural areas. Okay, so entry would be possible here. Remember, this was exactly what we did in that's what we had. Here. That we have cream skimming. This would be cream skimming. Okay. Of course, it's clear that Flixbus always would enter in destinations where Deutsche Bahn makes a lot of profit. Okay, and even though they have perhaps even higher costs than Deutsche Post, it would be profitable as prices on these destinations are higher, given that we have some kind of geographically uniform pricing. Okay. So the point is here, an entrant could enter even though that would be inefficient and would destroy the situation. In order to solve this entrant would have to pay an output tax of €50 if it entered this urban region. Okay. On the same time, and this is our second deviation or problem here. Suppose here our entrant would have costs of, say, 180 to supply the rural area. Okay, because they have to build up some masts for a mobile telephony system. Okay, they could enter for 180, but given that the price is 100, they wouldn't. Okay, so the point is now, if we have this output tax, they would receive a subsidy in terms of 100. Here, the subsidy the incumbent also pays per user in the rural areas, and they would enter. Okay, so you see why this output tax gives the right kind of incentives. Okay. So, but the problem is, of course, it's really complex because you have to have a different tax according to the different regions. Okay, but what I also wanted to highlight is the problem if you just allow for entry, given, and of course, the source of all the problems is this cross-subsidization. But of course, that's often for political reasons. In Germany, we have, even in our constitution, our Grundgesetz, we want to have gleichwertige Lebensverhältnisse. So everyone should face the same conditions of life somehow. Okay. So here you see sometime law really runs into trouble with economic realities, given you allow here for competition, unless you're able or smart enough to introduce such a policy. Okay, next point is the problem of excess entry. The problem of excess entry, actually, that's something which is just a standard problem in industrial organization, and I deal there with that in some detail, so I only look into that briefly here. This goes all back, or this has been analyzed in an interesting or influential paper by Gregory Mankiw and Mike Winston in, I don't know, 1986. And we simply look into a Cournot oligopoly, okay? And the question is, how many firms do enter in a Cournot oligopoly if we have a situation or a cost function where we have some fixed costs plus constant marginal costs? So our definition of sub-additivity of natural monopoly would be satisfied here. And the question is, if we want to maximize total surplus, okay, total surplus, remember no alpha, alpha equal to 1, is the free entry number of firms too many or too few? That's what we look into. We look into n firms, and the equilibrium output per firm depends on the number of firms, okay? If you have more firms in a market, each firm will become smaller. That's a standard outcome in Cournot, and total output will be just n times Qn, and typically it also holds that this total output increases if we increase the number of firms, at least in Cournot terms. Now, what Armstrong-Sepping do here, and what originally is also in Mankiw-Winston, is here that they put up nicely the welfare function. So this would be total surplus. Remember, alpha equal to 1. Here is just a gross consumer surplus, okay? Gross consumer utility, gross consumer surplus, GCS as we put it. And this is a function of a total output minus here we have total cost, okay? And gross consumer surplus is simply net consumer surplus plus revenue, and that's where we get here then the net consumer surplus, so consumer surplus plus profit. Okay, that's straightforward, and we also derived that the derivative of gross consumer surplus is nothing else than the price. And the price here is nothing else than the inverse demand function. What we always do is we just ignore the so-called integer constraint, and we assume that n is a continuous variable, and denote the free entry number of firms as n. And what we are doing here is we evaluate the welfare function, or actually the derivative of the welfare function as at this number. And the point is here, if we know this would be equal to 0, we know this is a welfare maximizing number of firms. If it's negative, we know we have too many firms. If it's positive, we should have more firms. Okay. And if we take a derivative of this expression up here, of course, we first take the derivative u prime, and then, of course, here have to apply chain rule and get then this expression here. And here again, here we have again the chain rule. So it's straightforward. Take the derivative here with respect to n, get c, and take the derivative of c with respect to n, get n times c prime, and then the derivative of q with respect to n. And here it's just rearranged. Here we substitute that u prime is nothing else than p, and putting that together here we have a p, here we have a c prime, the marginal cost. So putting this together here, and of course applying that. Of course, C is the same as P times Q, because P times Q is nothing else than the revenue of a single firm, and C is the cost of a single firm. And in the free entry equilibrium, the profit is equal to 0. Okay, that's what we have here. And now this point here is as Q prime is negative, we know price equal marginal cost. Price will be above marginal cost. This is positive. This is positive and Q prime is negative, so we get as a result that we get too many firms. Okay, that's what's written here. So in the free entry equilibrium, we have too many firms. There is so-called excessive entry. Welfare would be increased if we get fewer firms, if the final firm did not enter. Of course, there are two things here. Does this result or mean that we should put up barriers to entry? That is a partial liberalization better than a total liberalization? Yeah, it depends. If you assume alpha is equal to 0 and have a simple consumer welfare approach, consumers always gain because prices go down. Okay, there's a long discussion what the right kind of welfare measure is. In regulation, it's clear, but in antitrust, it's not so clear. Okay, it's also our result also in a sense depends on the point where we assume that we have homogeneous products. If we have differentiated products, if we have chamberlainian monopolistic competition and so on, if firms add variety and if consumers value variety, we might get a different results. Okay. And finally, if this entry is curbed by policy, if they say, okay, only a few firms need to enter, we get into trouble because these existing firms might just collude, okay? Because one of the most important forces to destroy collusive agreements is entry. That's what you saw, for instance, in the vitamin cartel. It really was destroyed by Chinese entrants, okay? So the threat of further entry is one of the best ways to limit collusion. And of course, it's rather implausible to think that the policymakers choose the right firms, okay? Which firms would you admit to the market in a real world where firms might have different costs and so on? Okay, of course, this result does not apply when the free entry number of firms is not larger than 1. Okay, it should be larger than or at least 2. Okay, it might be that even a monopoly is not profitable. Okay, yet the welfare would be higher if the monopoly could be persuaded to enter. Okay. No market is really a good thing. Remember, and that's where competition is bad, and where we had several examples there, even though even a monopoly could not break even, it still was optimal to pay a transfer because consumer surplus would be high enough to cover for it. Okay, that's this problem of excessive entry. Next point is entry barriers. I make a short break here. Okay, also a short break. Just one point with respect to these artificial entry barriers, set up by the government. Actually, we saw, I think it was in the 80s, a policy in the US under President Ronald Reagan, which was so-called voluntary export restraints. And that was actually the point where Ronald Reagan wanted to defend or to protect the US car industry. And so Japanese car manufacturers voluntarily restricted their exports to the US. And the point here was really that, of course, that meant that these Japanese firms, in a sense, the Toyotas and so on, were happy because they didn't have to face other entry by Japanese cars, okay, by Japanese car manufacturers. Okay, we make a short break here. Entry barriers and entry assistance. So the starting point is here that rather than getting excessive entry in many of our network industries, the problem is that it's hard to get an entrant at all. Okay, why is that so? Yeah, because incumbent firms typically have advantages over potential entrants. So, because I already told you about customer inertia, consumer ignorance about new offers, there are switching costs to move your phone provider or to an electricity provider and so on. You might also have predatory pricing. We had some predatory pricing cases in Germany, for instance. In Germany, Deutsche Post was how do we say that, convicted or beschuldigt. So the Federal Cartel Office said, or was of the opinion, that there was a so-called margin squeeze, that Deutsche Post charged too low prices for their service to business customers. So this is related to predatory pricing. And of course, in many instances, different from the far distance buses case, in order to be able to compete, these firms need access to vital inputs. For instance, if you want to sell electricity and if you generate electricity, you have to have access to the transmission or the distribution network. Okay, and these are clearly monopolistic bottlenecks in a sense. Okay, now how should we assist these entrants in order to overcome these barriers? And beyond normal competition policy, that means beyond just checking that firms do not price predatorily and so on. Okay, one, of course, possibility would be to just pay outright subsidies, direct financial subsidies. Just think in terms of this initiative of the German economics minister Altmaier to get a battery factory in Germany and paying, I don't know, 1 or 2 billion in terms of subsidies. Typically, that's not something that regulators are allowed to do. We all often cannot pay any subsidies to incumbents, and very often they don't pay to subsidies to entrants as well. So usually you don't do this. You might have tariff restrictions on the incumbents only. So you might have, what I already told you, these geographically uniform tariffs for the incumbent only. The point is then you run into this trouble. So the incumbent is not allowed to reduce its price in some areas. That's like Deutsche Telekom. We don't have what is called a regionalization of regulation. Deutsche Telekom cannot charge a lower price in some areas than in others. Okay, even though the cost situation is a different one in Cologne than in the Vogelsberg. Okay, and of course this might encourage entry of inefficient entrants, because that's what, just our example above. Remember, the price was 100, the costs were just 50. An inefficient entrant with cost of 80 could easily enter here. Okay, that's a problem as well. In the UK, you had so-called asymmetric line of business restrictions placed on the incumbent. So British Telecom was not allowed to supply cable TV services, but the cable TV services were allowed to, today we would call that double play or triple play. They were allowed to supply telephony and TV. Okay, again, this encourages inefficient entry, and in a sense, we always call off chilling competition. The incumbent firm might be useful competitor in TV services. Remember the Magenta offer, or I don't know, Deutsche Telekom called it Service Entertain for some time. Of course, that's then an important competitor, for instance, to the cable TV companies. Okay, and it might also eliminate possible economies of scope. Again, so it's not so easy. Once you have this problem with say, cross subsidization and so on, is always troubling. Okay, and here, of course, the inertia also works. But right now, it seems that at least in German internet services, you now got a rather lot of competition between, say, the cable TV companies and Deutsche Telekom. Okay, what we also have in terms of a discussion is that you require incumbent to lose a specified market share. This was a policy the UK had in terms of British gas. That's really a strange thing because in effect it requires a market to be less competitive. This sounds really strange, but just think of the discussion of German's Deutsche Bahn's position in far distance passenger transport, where it's almost 100% market share. But probably the most important competitor, and that's a different discussion we had, the most important competitor to Deutsche Bahn here is the aircraft and really the car. Okay, so here it's not so clear that this is a good idea, or whether the market share is a good measure of welfare or the situation in this market at all. Okay. For instance, here, what also comes to mind is this single buyer rule with football. Okay, so the Bundeskartellamt, the Federal Cartel Office, required that Deutsche Bundesliga didn't sell all the rights to a single supplier or a single buyer like Sky. Okay, and so they required the incumbent to lose or the supplier to lose market share. Limitations on further entry, this was in the beginning of liberalization. The UK had enacted a duopoly policy. There was a second, actually there was a single entrant, which was called Mercury, I think, and no further entrants were allowed. And here is what Armstrong Sepping say. So if a second entrant makes a first entrant unprofitable, why would second entry occur at all? Only, of course, if the second entrant would then be more efficient than the first entrant. So this is likely to foster collusion, and the beneficiary of this policy will be the incumbent. Okay, and final point here, all of these, now this is a rather informal discussion here. The final point here is that you require the incumbent to charge high retail prices. Okay, you require the incumbent to charge high retail prices, or the opposite is just low access charges. We will get to that. They have to supply their services on very favorable wholesale terms. And if you require the incumbent to charge high retail prices, of course, this makes entry easier. Okay, actually, in a sense, Deutsche Telekom was always in terms of regulation, required to charge a higher price than the entrant. Deutsche Lufthansa, this is, however, a famous case in terms of predatory pricing against Germania, when Germania was one of the first entrants in the German airlines market. They provided a service between Köln, Bonn, and Berlin, and the Federal Cartel Office said, okay, Lufthansa, you have higher costs, you have to charge a higher price. Okay, so high retail prices is clear. Is rather visible that it's a bad thing in a sense, because many customers will have to fund it, and of course it gives rise probably to inefficient entry. Yeah, and low access charges. Yeah, we will get back to that. However, these low access charges would mean that in the end we probably won't get any further investments by the incumbent. Okay, Now I already mentioned this several times, and if you compare that to your notes, I slightly changed the headline and also the numbering here. I worked on the structure. Now I want to discuss access regulation. And of course, if we regulate access, we also have to have a regulated access price. This is once we have, or comes into play once we have a vertical dimension to the problem, and where, actually I should also put that, where we have some monopolistic segment of these network industries. And in terms of electricity generation and distribution, you see everyone, in a sense, can be an electricity producer, just put some solar panels on your roof. But of course, if you produce more than you on your own will consume, you would like to sell it, and therefore you need to access to the distribution and transmission network. And this distribution network, this is simply a real natural monopoly in these common terms, or in the uses in this common usage, because here you certainly cannot duplicate this infrastructure. Similar holds for trains and tracks. Trains you might be able to buy, but to put your own tracks somewhere is really a monopolistic bottleneck. Okay, and the question is here, how might you introduce competition in the competitive part of these industries? And in order to have competition in this segment of the market which is able to have, or which is potentially competitive, firms require access to this monopoly part, okay, to the monopoly network input. And the question is, how do we optimally regulate this then? Okay, and one of the questions is, should we allow the network monopolist to operate in the competitive sector? Remember the discussion about Deutsche Bahn. Should Deutsche Bahn be vertically separated in a company which is the infrastructure manager, so which has the tracks here, and for instance the services, and in companies which operate trains like freight trains and passenger trains and so on? Okay, and similar discussion we had in terms of transmission, electricity transmission networks. Okay, and the question is then, if we what are the terms at which the competitive sector has access to the monopoly network? Which price should be set here? Okay, so here this is what is really, in a sense, the recent regulation of the last 20 years or so. Okay, and you will see it's a few rather straightforward concepts we can introduce here. So first of all, we look into the case of vertical separation. What does this mean? We have a monopoly network. Call these a transmission system operator like Tenet. Okay, they are unbundled, so they don't have generation capacity and so on, and or call it Network Rail, the UK network operator. Okay, and they have some marginal cost of operation C, and there are a number of identical competitors supplying services to consumers with some cost small c of converting a unit of access into a unit of final service. So the marginal cost of service to consumers is capital C plus small c, and the regulator sets some access charge A, okay, per unit of access to M's network. This unit of access is a more complicated thing. We discussed these track access charges, so this would be just a slot at a certain time for a certain amount of kilometers. And with per drop competition among these companies, among these electricity generators and so on, or these railway companies, we would just get equilibrium price equal A plus C. And of course, it's rather straightforward here that we simply set A equal to C, okay, to capital C, to the cost of the network. The problem, of course, before I get into more detail, if there is Cournot competition, we know that under Cournot competition, the price will be higher than the marginal cost. And here, and I think this is rather strange, the Armstrong-Sapping would say that we even would like to implement first best by paying subsidies, by having an access charge below C here, but it's a bit strange because above they make the assumption under competition we don't have transfers, but here this requires transfers. Okay. So the point is, if you have perfect competition on a downstream area, that's what it's called. Typically, this network infrastructure provider is called upstream, and the competitive sector would here be the downstream sector. Okay. Okay. Intuitive appeal of vertical separation. Even if the access charge is set incorrectly to high to low, because you do not know exactly what capital C is, competition is not distorted. Okay. That means that if you have differently efficient firms, it will always be the lowest cost firm which supplies the market. Okay, so there is productive efficiency. Lowest cost firm produces, but there's of course then not allocative efficiency because you don't have the correct excess charge because you do not know the exact cost of the infrastructure manager. Okay, but here this is a very simple problem. Of course, it abstracts of any economies of scope, so it's really the easiest way how you could put it, and you abstract from many important things, which if you have a real world problem, you have to look into. Okay, now next point is now we allow for vertical integration and assume there is no downstream regulation. Okay, so in a sense we have like with Deutsche Telekom, they have to supply access to rivals based on say DSL, also on call by call and so on. In the telecom sector, they have to supply it at regulated terms. It's so-called wholesale regulation. Okay, and it's not a regulation of the final final consumer's price. Okay. Okay. Now M, our incumbent, can supply directly to the consumer as well as supplying access to its rival. Suppose M has downstream cost for the network for the final service of C star, so its end-to-end marginal cost or these network costs plus the downstream cost would be capital C plus small c star. And what does it mean if A is suppose A would be higher than C. Suppose marginal cost, these X network costs are 1 and A is set at 2. Would that distort downstream competition? Not actually. Okay, you will see that if the entrant is more efficient than the incumbent in terms of the downstream access, these incumbent would then just use the entrance or supply the entrant rather with the wholesale service rather than directly supplying the consumers. So that's what you see here. And suppose the incumbent knows the rival's cost. So we have to compare what is the profit it makes if it serves consumers itself. The highest price it can set is simply, remember Bertrand, this would be a limit price, the excess charge plus C. Okay, so the profit is of the incumbent if it serves itself in the integrated version here is just P, the price it gets, minus its cost here. And as P is A plus C here, we get just A plus C minus C, capital C plus C star. Okay. Now, what happens if it does not supply its consumers itself, but it just supplies the rivals on wholesale terms with A and lets the rival supply the consumers? Now, it makes only profit from selling excess, and this is just A minus C. Okay. So this per consumer would it be, okay? So it doesn't matter what number of consumers we have. This would be A minus C. Under what circumstance is providing the consumers on your own, that is an integrated version, better than this wholesale service? Now, yeah, just what we had above there was this, and here we get this. A cancels out, as does C, and you see only if the entrance costs of the downstream part are higher than its own downstream subsidiary, it will provide its consumer on its own. Otherwise, it will just act as a wholesaler. Okay, and this is really the efficient strategy. So that's what I have here. Serve itself is better or more profitable than strategy 2 if C is great, if the entrant has higher cost than the incumbent's own downstream division, and that means if it's more efficient. So the excess charge does not bias downstream competition. That's very important. Okay, even though M's actual cost of using the network when it supplies its consumer is C star, its opportunity cost are just excess charge. This is misleading here, like its rivals. Okay, that's the important point. We don't get any inefficiency. Okay, and even though it could supply its users on its own, they won't if the entrant is cheaper. So if Deutsche Telekom knows 1 and 1 is much better in doing retail, they just will provide access. And that's what we see in many parts. So just see the cleaning of many companies is outsourced to some companies because they do it better. We do not see vertical integration everywhere. Okay? So very important point here. Of course, the problem is very often, and I can't go into detail here, so-called Bell doctrine. If you're regulated somewhere, if the final consumer price is also regulated, you run into trouble here. And so the ideal policy is, of course, to set excess charge equal to the network cost here. Okay, and this was this discussion above there with the small subsidies, if the entrants are the more efficient suppliers. Otherwise, a small subsidy, because here you just could reduce or regulate, in a sense, the incumbent, so that it has to charge a lower price if it's more efficient. Okay, yeah, competition we already discussed. Okay, so here no problem. If we don't have downstream regulation of the prices, we don't get into trouble. We will get undistorted downstream competition. Very important. Okay. Now, very often, however, we also have downstream regulation, and we have vertical integration. Okay, so we have both some cap on the final customer, on the price of the final customer, and some excess regulation. And this cap might even be only say geographically uniform prices or something like that, what you will see below. Okay, so this is our next case, the very famous efficient component pricing rule. I don't know whether I think I somewhere wrote it in full. It's also called the Baumol-Willig rule, going back to a paper written by William Baumol and Gregory Sidak. It's a Baumol-Willig rule, but there's a paper by Baumol and Sidak which spells it out in more detail in a Yale Journal of Regulation. Okay, so again, you will see in a minute, for the moment, our discussion is abstract, but I will give you a table so that it's rather clear. E's cost of converting access to the final service is C. Entry is desirable if the entrant has lower cost than the incumbent. Entry is profitable if the cost of the entrant plus the access charge are below the price. And these conditions coincide only if A is equal to P minus C. If you put it differently, if it's equal to the lost retail profit. This is also called retail minus. Okay, you have the final customer price P minus what you have in terms of avoided cost. Okay, and you have avoided the downstream cost. You have an excess charge, however, equal to the cost plus what you have in terms of the lost retail profit. Okay, that would have been the profit of the incumbent here. If this efficient component pricing rule gives the correct entry signals, but what entrants do not like, the profit of the incumbent is the same with and without entry, typically, in this simple rule where everything is linear. Okay, yeah, but M does not have an incentive to degrade or delay its excess services and so on. In the next example here, it will become clear. Again, same example as we previously had. So remember 50 and 200 in terms of cost, but now our costs are split up into retail cost and network cost. Retail costs are pretty much the same, and that holds in rural and in urban areas, but the network costs are rather different. Okay, and so here you see the point again. We have some regulation on the retail price, which would just be that you charge a uniform price here. And what now does our retail minus mean? What is the network excess charge? Again, suppose we have an excess charge A equal C. What would that mean? Now, yeah, A equals C, because this network cost is C here. A equals C would mean we get here, or we can get entry here by any company which has retail cost up to, say 70, okay? If A would be equal to C. So you would get a lot of inefficient entry, and of course you would destroy this profit you make here in this region, which is then used to cross-subsidize the rural area, okay? And therefore what this Baumol-Willig rule, or the ECPR, efficient component pricing rule, says, okay, you charge an excess charge which is equal to retail minus, that is the price, minus the avoided cost, which would be 20. Or put it differently, it would be 100 minus the profit which the incumbent makes here. It would be then the profit which makes incumbent here. Or I just put it differently. It would be 50 plus then, I just have to here to put it in the right way. So it would be the network cost plus the profit you lose. And here the network cost is the 30 plus the profit you lose is just the 50. Okay. And so it's 80. And the same holds here by construction for the rural area. okay, you also get a network access charge of 100, of 80. Again, 100 minus this 20, okay? And of course here, write signal, because if you have some network, if you have retail costs which are lower than 20, you can enter, okay? If you don't have retail costs which are lower than 20, you cannot enter. Again, retail minus. So here, these access prices are a convenient measure or means to levy these previous universal service obligation payments. Okay, here you get these profit in the urban areas, and here, of course, you need the funding. And since entrants require 1 unit of access per unit of output, no distortion is called if you have this output tax, and this is nothing else than our output tax here. Okay, this is just our profit we get here. Okay, so you put this output tax here. It would be just the total cost are 50, and the price is 100. So the output tax would 50, which is put on top of the network cost. Okay, yeah. So that's it, and we will have a few small examples here in rather straightforward examples and problems in a problem set in the assignment. Okay. Finally, just one small remark: this output tax is just the third way to calculate this access charge. Okay, the first was the retail minus price minus avoided cost. The second was this ECPR. That means network costs plus the profit the incumbent would make, and then the third is the network costs plus this output costs, output tax, which is actually then the same as this ECPR. Finally, the problem is this looks almost too perfect. Okay, we solve our problems. Unfortunately, and that's what I somehow already alluded to, we might get the trouble of bypass. Another important point here. A bypass destroys, in a sense, the optimality of the efficient component pricing rules. Now, the point is, suppose our one-in-one, our united internet, cannot only provide the retail or the resale services, but also build up a network itself. It can bypass the incumbent's network. Okay, and what is the cost of supply then? It has a cost of supply with standalone entry. That is, it sets up its own network from small c plus capital C head. If it uses M's network, it's C plus this capital C, and if it doesn't enter the entrant, of course, we just get this incumbent's cost here. The ECPR, you will see on the next slide, does not ensure efficiency, because even though if the network costs of the incumbent are smaller than the network cost of the entrant still will enter if the access charge are higher. The entrant will build its own network. That's what happened in many business districts. Okay, you supply the service in business district, and of course you bypass there and supply only the profitable regions. Okay, and I think if A equal to C again, which would give the right kind of investment incentives, you get the danger of cream skimming again. And that's what I'm going to show you in the next diagram here. Okay, suppose here same setup as previously. If the price is larger than C star plus C, of course, entry might occur even if the entrant is inefficient. And the point is, in order to help this here, we need both an output tax and a network charge. Now, the point is here, suppose you had our previous access charge of 80. If with this access charge of 80, everyone who has network cost below 80 could have entered here, if this company has a retail cost of 20. Okay, that's rather straightforward, yeah, because you have 70 and 20, so you could enter the market. So you can only solve this problem if you have an access charge equal to your cost here and an output tax. But typically you only have the one, you only have an access charge. And you see ECPR would just have this access charge of 80. But this would lead to bypass. Firms could enter and bypass here. So, and of course here we have always the same problem with the subsidy, but I look only into this case. You need this output tax. And that's what we have in many areas. Companies roll out in business districts a second telecommunication line because their access charge is too high, okay, even though they have higher costs. Okay, and that's what you get cream skimming. Actually, in the notes, I refer to a recent case in the UK on Royal Mail, where you have the situation where I don't know how this company was, not here, where this company it was called Whistle. Whistle in Germany we had, I don't know, this Dutch company, and what these companies do, they put out they provide letter service in certain urban areas on their own, and in other areas they just use the infrastructure from Deutsche Post here, and in the UK it's Royal Mail. And here the point is that Royal Mail somehow reacted to that, and the CMA, the Competition and Markets Agency in the UK, consider this an abuse of a dominant position. You might look into these details. But the problem is, and we will see that in more detail in the examples, here it's really hard to come up with the right policy. Okay, this policy is really complicated, unless you have prices according to marginal cost, but that's what you typically do not have, because you have the same prices in urban areas and in rural areas. Okay. Hopefully it's clear, and it certainly will even become clearer once we look into these simple, rather straightforward examples where you just need to put up these kind of tables. Actually, and that's the my last but one slide, even the Bundesnetzagentur, the federal network agencies, thought about introducing this kind of ECPR regulation, efficient component pricing rule. It's Vorleistungsprodukt, it's wholesale regulation, in terms of fiber optical infrastructures for FTTH, fiber to the home, or FTTB, fiber to the building. Okay, and what they have in this consultation document is, until recently we had cost-based regulating, where we start. You remember the KEL or ELRIC on European level. You start from some cost measure, and this is then the excess price, and this gives rise to some Endkundenpreis, to some price for the final customers. The problem is here that with all these fiber products, cost would be much above the price the companies can charge. About the willingness to pay of the customers, and that's why they use now, and this is really a strange kind of translation into German, a Nachbildbarkeitsansatz. What they mean is efficient component pricing rule, where they start from the final price, Deutsche Telekom charges, and then just deduct or subtract from that the avoided costs, which would be the retail cost. Okay, and they then get some margin for the company, for resellers. Okay, there's a lot of problem about that. I even wrote some paper on that, about the margin squeeze some 10 years ago, and was involved in Austrian cases, because here it's actually a margin regulation and not really a regulation which is based on the units here. Okay. Okay, anyway, the point is that many of these costs are actually not variable costs, but many of these costs of say downstream costs, these marketing costs, are fixed costs. Okay, and then you run into trouble. Okay, I think I'm done here. You see there would still be more to do, but actually this chapter 14 became part of the economics innovation lecture. Chapter 15 would be very interesting, but it's first not enough time. It would be this excess pricing in two-way industries. That is like the mobile phone business. In telecoms, you only had access, if you think of fixed line, there is one provider like Deutsche Telekom, and all these other companies like United Internet, they go for access to the Deutsche Telekom network. However, in terms of mobile phones, you have two-way access. That is, Vodafone needs access from Deutsche Telekom, and Deutsche Telekom needs access from Vodafone in order to transmit calls from their users to Vodafone users, Deutsche Telekom users to Vodafone users, and vice versa. Okay, that's a very interesting part, again with many important and famous papers by Jean-Jacques Lafont and Jean Tirole with Patrick Ray. But unfortunately, if you start to do a PhD course, we might do that, but not today. I'm finished with the lecture. I thank you for being with me. Okay, I just would appreciate if you could fill out the evaluation form we put on our intranet. You might also put, of course, comments on the YouTube if you're not part of JLU students, perhaps even someone not a JLU student watches these videos. Of course, I'm very happy to get any feedback on this course. It was the first time I did it this way. Thank you for being with me in Webex, and of course, I'm getting back now to Webex. I thank you for participating and hope you enjoyed it. I did. Goodbye. Yeah, so we are finished here. Actually, you saw also in the last year, I asked you to fill out the evaluation form and give feedback. I hope you do that well, or you will do that as well in this year. Final point I want to mention, hopefully it has become clear what this bypassing and this screen skimming is. That's rather important. And these are important terms in a day-to-day regulatory discussion. Okay, I'm finished, and I wish you a lot of success in your final exam. And of course, I'm available for further questions in Webex. Okay, thank you and goodbye.